It was just another ordinary afternoon in the bustling heart of the city. The streets were alive with the usual hum of activity, people rushing to work, street vendors calling out to passers-by, and the occasional blare of a car horn cutting through the noise. But in the midst of this everyday chaos, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would leave everyone who witnessed it questioning everything they thought they knew about power, prejudice, and the thin line that separates them. It all started with a man in a crisp suit, standing on the corner of 5th and Main, waiting for his ride. He looked like any other professional, polished, composed, and unassuming. But what no one could see, at least not yet, was the weight of the title he carried. A title that would soon turn the tables in the most unexpected way. As the man stood there, scrolling through his phone, a police cruiser rolled up to the curb. The officer inside, a burly man with a stern expression, stepped out and approached him. His demeanor was tense, his eyes scanning the man up and down with a look that was hard to read. Without warning, the officer grabbed the man's arm, his grip firm and unyielding. "You need to come with me," he said, his voice low but commanding. The man looked up, startled, his calm demeanor faltering for just a moment. "Excuse me," he replied, his tone polite but firm. The officer didn't budge. "I said, come with me. Now." The tension in the air was palpable, and the few people nearby began to stop and stare. Something about the scene felt off, but no one dared to intervene. The man hesitated, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't right, but he also knew that arguing with an officer in the middle of the street could escalate things quickly. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said calmly, but the cop wasn't having it. "Misunderstanding? You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for. Now, I'm not going to ask you again." The man's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than patience crossed his face. He knew what this was about. He'd seen it before, heard the stories, and even fought against it in his own way. But he never thought it would happen to him. Not like this. Not here. As the officer began to lead him toward the cruiser, the man's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew he had to do something, but what? He couldn't just let this happen, not when he had the power to stop it. But revealing who he was could change everything. It could make things better, or it could make them so much worse. The crowd around them was growing now, their murmurs rising into a low buzz of curiosity and concern. Phones were out, recording every second of the encounter. The officer seemed to notice this too, his grip tightening as he quickened his pace. "Move it," he barked, his patience wearing thin. The man stumbled slightly, his polished shoes scraping against the pavement, and then, in a moment that would later be replayed countless times online, he made his decision. He stopped walking, planting his feet firmly on the ground. The officer turned, his face red with frustration. "I said move," he shouted, his voice echoing down the street. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he looked the officer straight in the eye, his expression calm but unwavering. "Officer," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I think you need to take a closer look at who you're dealing with." The cop frowned, his confidence wavering for the first time. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. The man reached into his pocket, and for a split second, the officer's hand went to his holster. But what the man pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a small leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a badge that glinted in the sunlight. The officer's eyes widened as he read the words engraved beneath it. His face went pale, his grip loosening as he took a step back. "Governor?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd erupted into gasps and whispers, the tension in the air reaching a breaking point. The man, no, the governor, stood tall, his presence commanding the space around him. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes said everything. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged, profiled, or mistreated because of the color of their skin. It was about a system that had failed too many for too long. And as the officer stood there, frozen in shock, the governor knew that This moment was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. But for now, the streets were silent, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. And as the cameras continued to roll, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The governor stood there, his badge still glinting in the sunlight, as the officer's face shifted from confusion to outright panic. The crowd around them had grown larger, their murmurs now a cacophony of shock and disbelief. Phones were raised high, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. The officer, whose name tag read Officer Daniels, took another step back, his hand trembling as he released the governor's arm. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. The governor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing back on Daniels. "You didn't know," he repeated, his tone calm but laced with something sharper. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't stop to ask. You didn't stop to think. You just assumed." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. His radio crackled faintly from his belt, a reminder of the world outside this moment. But he didn't reach for it. His focus was entirely on the man standing before him, a man who, just moments ago, he had treated like a common criminal. The governor closed his wallet and slipped it back into his pocket, his movements deliberate and measured. He wasn't in a rush. He wanted Daniels, and everyone watching, to feel the weight of what had just happened. "Do you know why I was standing here, Officer Daniels?" he asked, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that made the crowd lean in closer. Daniels shook his head, his face pale. Sir," he managed to say. The governor nodded as if he had expected that answer. "I was waiting for my driver. I had a meeting across town, a meeting about police reform, actually. Funny how life works, isn't it?" The irony wasn't lost on anyone, and a few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. But the governor's expression remained serious. He wasn't here to entertain. He was here to make a point. "You see, Officer Daniels, this isn't just about you and me. This is about a system that's broken, a system that allows people like you to make snap judgments about people like me, without ever stopping to consider the consequences. And today, you got caught. But how many others haven't? How many others have been treated this way and didn't? Have a badge to pull out?" The question lingered, unanswered, as the crowd fell silent. Even the city's usual noise seemed to fade into the background, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Daniels looked down at his feet, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the governor's words. He wanted to say something, anything to defend himself, but the truth was he couldn't. He had acted on instinct, on bias, and now he was facing the consequences. But the governor wasn't done. "I'm not here to embarrass you," he continued, his voice softer now but no less powerful. "I'm here to make you think, to make all of us think. Because if we don't, nothing will ever change." As the governor spoke, a black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the scene like a mirror. The driver, a young man in a sharp suit, stepped out and opened the rear door, waiting patiently. The governor glanced at the car, then back at Daniels. "I have to go," he said, "but this conversation isn't over, not by a long shot." With that, he turned and walked toward the SUV, the crowd parting to let him through. Daniels watched him go, his mind racing. He wanted to call out, to apologize, to explain himself, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he stood there, frozen, as the governor climbed into the car and shut the door behind him. The SUV pulled away, leaving Daniels alone in the middle of the street. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers growing louder as they replayed what they had just witnessed. Daniels finally reached for his radio, his hands still shaking. "Dispatch, this is Daniels," he said, his voice barely audible. I need to report an incident." There was a pause on the other end before a calm voice responded. "Go ahead, Officer Daniels. What's the situation?" Daniels took a deep breath, his eyes darting around as if he could still see the governor standing there. I think I just made a huge mistake, he admitted, his voice breaking. Meanwhile, inside the SUV, the governor leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. His driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, concern etched on his face. "Everything okay, sir?" he asked. The governor didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the city blur past. "No," he said finally, "but it will be. It has to be." He pulled out his phone and began typing a message, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. He knew this incident would make headlines. He knew it would spark debates, arguments, and maybe even protests. But he also knew it was a moment that couldn't be ignored, a moment that had the power to change things, if people were willing to listen. As the car sped toward his next meeting, the governor's mind was already racing ahead. He thought about Daniels, about the crowd, about the countless others who had experienced something similar but didn't have the platform to speak out. He thought about the work that still needed to be done, the conversations that still needed to be had. And he thought about the weight of his own role in all of it. He wasn't just a man in a suit. He wasn't just a politician. He was a symbol of hope for some and a target for others. And today, that symbol had been put to the test. Back on the street, Daniels was still standing there, his radio crackling with questions he didn't know how to answer. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. But deep down, he also felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A flicker of doubt, a question he couldn't shake. What if he was wrong? What if everything he thought he knew was just wrong? It was a terrifying thought, but it was also the first step toward something bigger, something real. And as he finally climbed back into his cruiser, he knew that his life, and maybe even the lives of others, would never be the same. As the governor's SUV disappeared into the flow of traffic, the city seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next act in a play that had only just begun. On the surface, life went on. Cars honked, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, and the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The encounter between the governor and Officer Daniels had sparked a ripple effect, one that would soon spread far beyond that street corner. For Daniels, the hours that followed were a blur. He returned to the precinct, his mind still reeling. From what had happened, his fellow officers could sense something was off, but no one pressed him for details. Not yet. He sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. The weight of the governor's words echoed in his mind. This isn't just about you and me. This is about a system that's broken. Daniels had always considered himself a good cop. He followed the rules, did his job, and tried to keep the streets safe. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that maybe the system he served wasn't as just as he'd believed. It was a thought that made his stomach churn. Meanwhile, the video of the encounter had already begun to make its way online. It started with a few shaky clips uploaded by bystanders, but within hours it had gone viral. News outlets picked it up, and social media exploded with reactions. The hashtag #SheOrderGovernor and the Cop began trending, with people on both sides of the debate weighing in. Some praised the governor for his calm demeanor and powerful message, while others criticized him for not taking stronger action against Daniels. The officer, for his part, found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't seen coming. His face was everywhere, his name plastered across headlines. Strangers online dissected his every move, his every expression, and the scrutiny was relentless. The same time, the governor's team was working overtime to manage the fallout. His press secretary, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Claire, had already drafted a statement, but the governor insisted on holding off. "This isn't just a PR moment," he told her during a tense phone call. "This is bigger than that. We need to let people sit with it for a while. Let them feel it." Claire sighed, knowing he was right, but also aware of the risks. "Sir, the longer we wait, the more control we lose over the narrative," she argued. But the governor was firm. Sometimes, Claire, the narrative needs to breathe. Let it. As the day turned into evening, the story continued to unfold in unexpected ways. In a small apartment on the other side of the city, a young woman named Tasha watched the video on her phone, her heart pounding. She recognized Daniels immediately. He was the same officer who had stopped her brother just a few months ago. That encounter had ended with her brother in handcuffs, despite having done nothing wrong. Tasha had tried to file a complaint, but it had gone nowhere. Now, seeing Daniels face to face with the governor, she felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment things would finally change. She grabbed her laptop and began typing, determined to share her family's story while the world was paying attention. Across town, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, Daniel's wife, Maria, sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. She had seen the video too, and her heart ached for her husband. She knew he wasn't a bad person, but she also knew he had made a terrible mistake. When he finally came home that night, she was waiting for him. "We need to talk," she said, softly, her eyes filled with a mix of love and worry. Daniels nodded, too exhausted to argue. As they sat together, the weight of the day pressing down on them, Maria reached for his hand. "This doesn't have to define you," she told him, "but you have to be honest about what happened, not just with them, with yourself." Back at the governor's office, the team was preparing for the inevitable media storm. Reporters were already camped outside, their cameras trained on the building's entrance. Inside, the governor sat with his closest advisors, discussing their next steps. "We have an opportunity here," one of them said. "This could be the push we need to get the reform bill passed." The governor nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Daniels, about the fear in his eyes, the way his hands had trembled. He knew the officer wasn't the real enemy. The real enemy was the system that had shaped him, the biases that had been ingrained in him over years, maybe even generations. Changing that system wouldn't be easy, but the governor was more determined than ever to try. As the night deepened, the city remained restless. Protests began to form in some neighborhoods, with people demanding accountability and change. In others, counter-protests sprang up, with voices arguing that Daniels was just doing his job. The divide was stark, and the tension was palpable. But amidst the chaos, there were also moments of connection. Strangers shared their stories online, finding solace in the knowledge that they weren't alone. Community leaders organized town halls, urging people to come together and talk, rather than shout. And in the quiet corners of the city, individuals like Tasha and Maria began to find their voices, determined to turn this moment into something meaningful. The governor, sitting alone in his office late that night, stared out at the city skyline. He knew the days ahead would be difficult. There would be backlash, criticism, and challenges he couldn't yet foresee. But he also knew this was a turning point, a chance to confront the issues that had been ignored for far too long. As he turned away from the window and reached for his coat, he felt a strange sense of calm. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a while, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. And as he stepped out into the night, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning.